Welcome to Into the Dataverse. This is a podcast where we talk about all things open data. This week, we're really excited to talk to our friend Ellie about DeSci, which is a topic that I'm super excited about. So, yeah, without further ado, introduce yourself.
I was born in Michigan. I grew up there. And then through a series of
Oh my
events,
goodness.
ended up jumping into Minerva for university and getting really, really obsessed with innovation. And I was trying to figure out how it happened, especially because I think I was just confused about the way we pitched innovation, which was, some brilliant person does some really cool thing. But then I had been taking a lot of psychology classes, and a lot of the focus was on the cultural ratchet and how, in reality, there's a lot of background research and information and work that goes into creating an innovation, some light bulb. A lot of general, almost revisionist history type things where we were like, actually, this guy didn't create this thing. Here's the 5,000 people that were behind it. It's a very San Francisco thing. Like this single person, huge brilliance, creates
Usually a
some
white dude.
exactly, some white dude that makes things happen. And I was like, is it really like that? Why is it only white dudes? And then and so this was just like a little thing that I was picking at. I started going into economics and understanding like, all right, how do economies work? How do we create a more efficient or not efficient, but innovative economy? How do you free people up to be doing creative things, doing exciting things? And I started picking at that scab for a while. And then a friend of mine, one day, we were sitting on the floor in my dorm room drinking coffee because this became a habit of ours when we were in Berlin with San Francisco, with Minerva. And
Cool.
he
I
was
love
like,
Berlin.
I'm creating this application for distributed peer review in order to make sure that more people can be involved in how to review science. And I was like, oh,
That
this is
sounds so
great.
cool.
And it's super fascinating because I think I had one of the most formative classes I had taken in my second year actually was this it was a psychology class, but a huge part of the course was research practices. And my professor was just really passionate about the best open science practices that you could do. And basically, it also led to me catastrophizing about the state of science very early on in my exploration
Okay.
because I was just like, oh my God, 80% of psychology doesn't replicate. And then
Yeah,
they were like, and also cancer research. And I was like, no, like this is really bad. I was like,
that's really
psychology I
bad.
couldn't get. We're fuzzy humans, we do some wild stuff. It changes. But if our cancer research isn't replicating, then like, all right, maybe we should care. And psychology we should care about as well. I really appreciate psychology as a field. But I understand why it would be harder to get it to replicate, you know?
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, it's what is that? The acronym weird, white,
yes.
white educated something.
Industrialized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't remember what it was, but the same whatever, I'll look it up later. But like that acronym about like why all psych studies aren't replicable is because they're just like
Exactly.
this one very specific group of people that they've been testing it on who are like getting credit for class. So
Exactly.
yeah, I remember what I learned
Exactly.
about that. It was pretty jarring. And then to hear that about cancer research, they usually just do it on white men instead of
Terrible.
testing
Maybe we
things
should.
on other people, like other populations, other people, like women. They don't know how women like react to medications a lot of the time,
Right.
or black people or brown people. It's
Right.
just, yeah.
Assumption that one population generalizes to all populations, but it's a very poorly based assumption. And so as I started talking to this friend, he was more just focused on, all right, how do you create interface to science, which allows people to like have input into it. I was like, oh, that's fascinating. It gives you more ability to distribute the labor of science, which is another thing that comes up in a lot of these conversations is okay, especially with LLMs, but in general, we're increasing the amount that we're creating papers all the time because this is our incentive mechanism is publish paper, publish paper, publish paper. But then the actual quality of review keeps going down because you keep squishing the amount of time that people can dedicate to review because review isn't compensated, it's
Yeah.
not cared for, it's not
Right.
it's not part of your daily work. It is a thing that you do in honor of science. But when you're working 80 hours a week,
Yeah, it's not.
Like your capacity for in honor science does decrease. It makes a lot of sense that it decreases. And so I was just thinking about that, as well as the ability to be like, just like the three people who are reviewing your article are probably going to be people in your field with the same biases as you, all of these same groupings, in part because that's who has succeeded in science. But it's hard. It's like you have to become really aware of, oh, you only used a weird population.
Yeah.
Or you only used, or your population is too small, or your population is this, or your sample doesn't include these groups of people, but in this group of people were able to read into it, they would be able to be like, oh, but this doesn't apply to me. I'm going to leave a comment about that. And so, versus if you have been doing stuff in the field for a while, you might not think about it as much. And so, I think that was like what really captured me. And then I started just kind of playing around in science space. And so me and that friend, another friend, we kind of pursued building out this. And we added another, or we kind of switched to another direction in like a startup incubator thing that focused on search for science. Hey, Google, you put in a keyword and then you get a bunch of information, but the relevance is quite low and it doesn't update. It doesn't intake that what I'm actually looking for is this field with this specific information, all of these things. And so you keep like hitting keywords, hitting keywords, hitting keywords, and it's a skill. But what if Google could update? So I say it like this, and it improves the incoming information so that my search is faster. I think it started really developing this idea in me, but also among us as a team, which is, hey, what are computers meant to do? What are humans meant to do? I think the core thing that we were feeling is that humans are meant to sense make and say yes or no and determine what's going on and kind of gather all of this information and then create a narrative out of it. And that's something that humans are really, really great at. But most of their time is actually spent finding papers, finagling, seeing if you can actually email a bunch of people in order to get the data set in the first place. And I think there's something kind of similar to papers, but not really. It's called data munching, which is just like making your data work for you. They're like, researchers spend 80% of their time doing that. And it's like, why? That is not the fun work of science. And not just the fun
Tell
work,
me
but the
about it.
work that humans are best at, right? We tend to be bad at being super, super nitpicky about making everything accurate. And so then we have messed up data and then we have unreplicable results. And there's just it's such a cascade. And so yeah, I really just started getting into that route. And then became aware of DeSci through I was talking to some person in SF and they were like, you need to go see DeSci. And I just started showing up to events and talking both about the project that we were doing, but just to people about what was going on in science and how they were settled on it. And then ended up talking a lot to DeSci Labs, which focuses on the kind of the identifier part of science, which is a very unsexy part of science. It's like, DOI, that random link that looks kind of ugly that has a specific suffix for all of these and prefix for these papers. We're gonna work on fixing that. And I was like, oh, that's crazy. Why are you fixing that? And so much of that work was just, oh, we're actually not identifying data. We're not identifying code. We're only identifying PDFs. But my computer can't really read a PDF. Like we've done some workarounds, but it can't actually figure it out. So all of science that is just held in this lovely category on our computer is completely inaccessible. Like my computer cannot help me. It's up for me to read through the entire corpus of science to figure out what's going on. And I was like, oh yeah, maybe we should be able to identify all of these other things such that when I go look for a data set, instead of not having any system really to do that well, we have a system that is well documented, that is persistent, it'll stay there forever, as long as you're paying for the storage, or even if somebody else decides I want to store it, they can store it as well, that you can actually access in context of the paper. So Googling for a data set is kind of hard because there's no metadata attached to it. There's no information. And so the likelihood that your keyword is going to pick up that data is quite low unless you're in like a place to find data. But if it's attached to the paper, you can find the paper and it also has the data. So it's just like, how do you streamline a lot of these workflows? And the reality that we didn't actually have a good way to do that was kind of shocking to me. Not shocking because I had heard it before, but just disappointing. But yeah, that's how I got started in DeSci.
Cool. I mean, that really resonates with me a lot. That's super interesting. And yeah, I think there's a really this thing where we think of science as like this objective thing where there's a margin of error, but there's not going to be like these huge gaping holes in the research. And there's a lot more subjectivity, I think, involved in it and inaccessibility that create further layers of just this is not necessarily correct. This is not up to date. This is like the wrong, whatever, the wrong methods. I think yeah, it's kind of crazy. And a dog just popped up in the background. What has it been like since you've gotten involved? Have any of your perceptions changed? I know that you mentioned like you had this idea before going into it about, what needed to be done or something that's like really surprised you since you started working in DeSci.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing that I've been coming away with, and actually a friend of mine articulated this really well yesterday in a conversation we were having. And it's that building infrastructure for science will not solve the problem because science is really gatekept. It's gatekept not only by the culture, but by the institutions, which need to make sure that they're producing some amount. It's gatekept by the individuals who need to make sure that they're like able to stay in these institutions, who have very clear requirements for what they're doing. It's gatekept by the government, who has a lot of opinions about what we should be researching. I think where I've shifted in as I entered, I was thinking of moving into like startups and building things, and I am definitely in that space. I'm kind of draped across many organizations and helping and participating in a lot of the startup portion of this. But most of where I'm trying to go is actually in creating workshops that bring researchers, policymakers, funders, like everybody who needs to be there needs to be there. And researchers, not just from weird population, but from everywhere else as well. And I think the thing that I've been feeling or that I've been leaning into most is just that in a lot of ways, building tools is not that hard. But the biggest barrier to especially scientific startups is just it's really hard to enter that space. I think a lot of startups, a lot of social startups, we've seen so many of those come into the scene. And yeah, but they're there because that population is very accessible. Everybody's able to jump on. It's very low effort, low barrier, low entry. But like researchers are very hyper specialized. And you saying, all right, now mess with your whole workflow is really difficult. And not just because it's not just because it's difficult to get an individual to do it, but because it's a very rigid system all the way down. And so it requires this approach in both directions. Like you can't just go directly to policymakers and say, make something happen, because they're going to be very slow. It's going to take a lot of time. They're going to have to understand what's going on. They're going to have to see a lot of proof. There's a lot of these gaps. And then you also can't really just go to scientists and be like, I'll bend the system, because they're so dependent and reliant on it. I think especially in the US, I don't know as much about the landscape in Europe, but in the US, tenure is what we drive for. It's like what you have to get. And in order to do that, you've got to publish. Like there is a rat race, there is a drive that everyone's on that needs to be on. And so I guess the main thing that I've become more and more aware of and have been starting to build towards with an organization that I'm starting up, or a collaborative that I'm starting up with another person John, who we will talk to sometime in the future, called SciOS. And the focus is just, hey, we get the people who are building a bunch of stuff who will solve all of these scientist problems together with the scientists who are like, these are all my problems. And also the policymakers who are actively drafting policy in order to somehow get us to move this big, massive wheel. It is a wheel. It can shift, but it takes a lot of weight to put behind it in order to make sure that we're like crossing all the parties, getting all the parties in one place. And it's slow. I think it's always one of those things where like startup mentality is, and in 3 years, and scientist mentality is maybe in 20 years we'll be able to. It's very different timelines. And I think that's been something that I've been working with more, is like, all right, what's the 10-year plan? What's the 20-year plan? Where are we going? And how do we make sure that in the intermediate, we're actually actively doing the work of bringing in the right people, making sure that everybody has a say if they need to, like the appropriate people have to say. And yeah, and just I think the other big question that I have is just, how do you support organizations that are doing this infrastructure work when there's not really enough money in it, and VCs are kind of iffy on DeSci in general, which I think is fair. I'm not a super huge fan of VC funding not in DeSci. I think it could be good. I think VC funding could be good, except currently most VC funding focuses on how do you expand your audience as fast as you can. I think that's not going to work in DeSci. Just because. And so I think if there's a huge pressure on a research organization to do that, then I think it will compromise the actual mission of doing work that distributes science and makes it more accessible. Because if I'm like, my current analysis of the funding situation is the people who have money are journals, and journals are really good at gatekeeping. And if we keep feeding journals to gatekeep, then we're going to keep feeding journals to gatekeep, and we're not functionally changing a lot of the incentives behind why science is stuck the way it is. So either journals need to get it together or we need to find another route through into science.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to be the other route. I don't see them getting it together anytime soon.
Yeah.
There's not enough. And I know it's really hard to get funding for science. I've recently saw something where there was like a kid who had this rare genetic disease, a rare genetic disorder. And there had been a study where they were trying this medication on other kids who had the same disorder. And it was actually like pretty promising, the results of it, but they couldn't continue the study because there wasn't enough funding, because it was a rare genetic disorder. So not enough people are interested in funding a cure for that, because it's not going to make enough money for any of the companies that fund medical science, pharmaceutical companies. So it just fell apart, and now other kids can't receive that treatment.
Funding is super huge. And I think you can go like from the level of where is money allocated, which is, at least in the US, mainly military funding, mainly military research as well. I think it's like 50% of it. But maybe, don't quote me on that. I'm not actually remembering the number, but it was a lot. And then you go down one level. It's like, all right, how is money distributed? And it's mainly by a lot of grant writing. So researchers on average will win like 25% of their grants, but it'll take greater than a month to apply for grants. And so you've got to do 4 months of your year in order to get one of your grants. And so you're kind of stuck in this where it's like, well, that's a lot of time preparing for grants. And in the end, we would have gotten much more work out of it. We would have wasted a lot less time for just on the scientist end, even. It's like the problem is all of this funding, the way that grants works is it funnels money into specific locations. It's like a city on a map. And that's fine, except it means we miss the mountains. You miss a lot of what could be discovered because everybody's only focused on submitting for grant applications that have specific visions of what should be true. And it means that it's a lot harder to switch out of the current rave. And it also makes it hard to course correct. So one example of this was a study done on oxytocin, where they're like, oxytocin, it's this trust chemical, does all these things. It was such a sexy study, you know? It's like one of those
I
studies that,
remember.
right? And it's like this is how you react to this chemical. And it's this chemical who's giving us this deep insight about us as human beings. 10 years of massive amounts of funding going into this research because it's a massive hype. And at the end of 10 years, someone finally gets enough funding to replicate the original study. And they're like, it doesn't replicate. But it's been 10 years of shoving money into this
That's
concept,
actually insane. That's
right?
insanity.
Right? And it was a lot of money because it was a biochemical research, right? You've got to have wet labs and you've got to have people that you're testing things on. It's so much. It's a very expensive field. But we couldn't course correct because nobody was checking. And so, damn. And everybody has to go into what's being funded.
It's more like pop neuroscience, but yeah, kind of just pop psychology and stuff like that, things that go viral in the mainstream. And, a lot of the times that one obviously is biochemical, so it's a bit different, but a lot of times the science wasn't really accurate to start with. So, which is obviously why it's not replicable. But there are also people, like you said before, who have a vested interest in getting published or publishing their own book or so they can get tenure or whatever. But have you
Yeah.
seen anything that's been like promising that you're excited about? Like anything that's really encouraging or, yeah, something to end on a good note?
It's been really, really exciting, especially recently, to be able to engage with so many people who are really committed to all of the things we've been talking about, right? They're like, hey, at the very base level, we need data that's open. What do we need to do to make data that's open? And then you've got some engineer who's hyper focused and builds out this great data structure that'll solve all our problems. And then you've got people in policy who are like, I learned yesterday that there was this thing that solves all of our problems. And I never knew it existed. And now I need to figure out how to write policy for it. And they're really invested in making that happen. And there's researchers who show up and are like, whoa, it would be so nice if when I saw a paper, I could evaluate a specific claim. And so then they build out this whole structure that's based off of how you might be able to, as a researcher, collaborate with many other researchers in order to create a collective map that demonstrates the weight of the evidence on a specific claim. And it gives us more information to be able to say, hey, this claim has a bunch of evidence for it, but there's a couple of evidences against it. Maybe we should check it out. Or maybe this claim doesn't have anything that's supporting or moving against it, but we seem to be doing research that builds on it. Maybe we should check that foundation. And so I think ultimately everybody has found their niche and they see their little piece of the puzzle and they're like, this is how I'm going to solve it. And in that way, there's at least enough saints, I think, to pull us all together. We just really do need to be coordinated. I think that's the big takeaway that I have right now is our favorite undefinable word of interoperability. My favorite undefinable word, I don't know if it's
Yeah.
yours,
I think
is
it's
like,
everyone's favorite.
It's everyone's favorite. Everybody's getting super excited. And the point is just I I want to be able to choose, hey, I'm going to use DeSci nodes as my data structure. But then you're over there and you're using nano publications. And I don't want you to need to switch to DeSci nodes. Because this is ultimately, I think, what can create what creates resilience against the kind of centralization and
Yeah.
authentication that
Having this data that
right,
anybody can access, it doesn't matter what interface you're using on top of it. Like you could use whatever you want and you still have access to the exact same data.
right. And it creates resilience in a way that is actually ecologically resilient. Instead of,
Yeah.
I think, have this too big to fail thing, which was really helpful when we didn't have the technology to make decentralization happen. There's a reason why we centralize because okay, you need to be really stable in order to support science. Okay, great. But now we recognize that that doesn't serve us anymore. And so we need to do the work of combining all of this research and information in a way that can that can make sure that each group is able to pick their part, focus on it, but also work globally so that we don't have these silos and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, totally. It's super exciting. For me, it's the use case for decentralization that I'm the most interested in, but also just in general, it has to have a huge impact if enough people adopt it, crossing my fingers. But yeah, I mean, it's awesome the work that you're doing. And yeah, thank you so much for talking to me about it. And I'm excited for our next conversation with your friends about what you guys are doing at DeSci Labs and everything like that. But yeah, thanks so much.